Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Urban Institute. I'm David Pitts. I'm Vice President for Justice Policy here at Urban, and I'm happy to have all of you with us here in person, but even more of you with us remotely today, so thanks all for joining. We have a fantastic panel discussion planned for you, but before I introduce the speakers, I want to briefly cover some housekeeping items. First, as you know, this is a hybrid event. We have an audience here in the room, and we also have those of you watching online. We want to engage with everyone during the Q&A period, so if you are watching online, we ask that you submit questions at any point during the conversation using the Q&A box. If you're here in the room, we will have handheld mics for you when the time comes. The event is being recorded, and we will share that recording along with other relevant information with you after the event's over. And if you would like more detailed information about our speakers, we invite you to look at their biographies online on the event page. Finally, if any of you have access issues or problems viewing the event, we ask that you please contact events@urban.org. So with that aside, I'd like to introduce our panel. So today's conversation, as you know, will focus on the culture of policing and police reform. But even if you take police out of it, right, you have these two topics, culture and reform, that cut across every aspect of the criminal legal system. And here at Urban, where our research, our training, and our technical assistance are all generally in service of policy change and service of reform, we see these dynamics at work every day in our work. So, for example, we're working with prosecutor offices now to create a culture of data readiness, the use of evidence in decision-making, but all with an eye toward transparency, fairness, and equity in outcomes. In our prisons work, we are trying to use our research to create a culture of transparency, a culture of bottom-up innovation to improve the conditions in which officers work and incarcerated people live. So what our research shows us is that culture change is incredibly difficult. It is particularly difficult in the criminal justice system, and as our panel is going to talk about, and as I personally believe, it is even more difficult still in the context of police. So we're fortunate today to have with us some speakers with extensive expertise on these topics. We have with us Michael Sierra Arevalo, who's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Texas, and who has written a really fantastic book, The Danger Imperative, that is going to anchor our discussion today. If you've not yet had a chance to read The Danger Imperative, it is, in my opinion, a fascinating ethnographic account of three police departments, the culture within them, and how that culture interacts with their day-to-day jobs. So it really is going to be an interesting conversation. We also have with us Walter Katz, who's a senior fellow with the Council on Criminal Justice, and who has worked extensively with major police departments across the United States, both in police reform and also in police oversight. Finally, joining the discussion will be Urban's own Jesse Janetta, who is a senior policy fellow and an expert in community safety. And moderating will be Jocelyn Fontaine, Vice President for Strategic Program Development, also here at Urban. So with that, I will ask our panelists to join me on the stage, and I will thank you once again for joining today. Welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Everyone got very quiet at the perfect time, which we appreciate. So thank you all for joining us again. My name is Jocelyn Fontaine. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Program Development here at the Urban Institute and also a Senior Fellow for Justice Policy at the Urban Institute, and really appreciate the folks who are in this room and also folks who have joined us virtually. As David said, sort of the topic of our conversation today, the culture of policing and police reform, in some ways is relatively broad, but the foundation or the motivation for our specific conversation this afternoon is motivated by the recent release of a compelling new book called The Danger Imperative, Violence, Death, and the Soul of Policing by Dr. Michael Sierra Arevalo. And books are for purchase just outside this, this room from the People's Book, which is a local bookseller in Tacoma Park here in the DC area. So I hope you can join us and the seller in making a purchase of the book if you have not already read it. So as David said, Michael is a sociologist by training and an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. He's an expert in policing, in guns, in gangs, and in violence prevention, and his writing and research have been featured pretty prominently in media outlets as well as in leading academic journals, and I'm so delighted that he is here. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much.
So his book, just a little preview, he's going to talk about the key findings a little bit more, is drawn from extensive interviews and hours of field observations in 3 police departments and provides new evidence demonstrating that the institution of policing is overly violent. We wanted to host a conversation with Michael and really host a conversation with our panelists as well as all of you who are here, given the ongoing and critical discussions about in the academic and the policy community, of course, as well as the broader and national conversation, which includes but is not limited to the critical discussions we had around the killing of George Floyd at the hands of police officer Derek Chauvin, about the role of modern policing in advancing community safety effectively and being a legitimate actor in the production of durable public safety. I'm extremely delighted. It feels like an honor to moderate this conversation, what I hope to be a rich discussion about, again, the culture of policing and police reform and the implications of that, of the culture for our reform efforts. Pleased to share the stage. I wanted to give a little bit about some grounding about how I'm coming into this conversation. I certainly do not consider myself a policing expert, but I do come into this discussion as a scholar and a person who's done a fair amount of research and evaluation on police reform efforts, particularly focused on police training and whether that's a meaningful mechanism to drive reform and change, and documenting the extent to which training efforts in particular lead to organizational changes in the ways in which police operate, the ways that they relate to community members, particularly folks in Black and brown communities, and how it's related to their performance. I do consider myself an expert and quite knowledgeable and deeply passionate about the role that the police and the justice system more broadly have played in historically and persistently marginalizing and surveilling communities, particularly communities of color, and the consequences of that history for modern policing and the criminal justice system and our reform efforts generally. So I'm super curious to hear Michael's reflections on those. Those are 2 things, training, as well as the history of policing in this country that he grapples with and talks about in his book. So enough for me and enough about my context and what I'm coming into this conversation with. And so let me turn it over to our panelists. So we're going to hear more from Michael. He'll put the findings of his book in the context of this conversation, and we're going to have Walter Katz and Jesse Janetta sort of respond to the top-line findings of the book and bring their own perspective and lens into the work. So very briefly, Walter Katz is currently a senior fellow at the Council on Criminal Justice, which is a nonpartisan membership organization and think tank, serving as an incubator for evidence-informed criminal justice policy. Walter's had a number of jobs, including formerly my dear colleague. He's been a public defender, a deputy inspector general, and an independent police auditor, and importantly for this conversation, a deputy chief of staff for public safety in Chicago, where he led oversight efforts and police reform efforts. Last but certainly not least, we're going to have Jesse Janetta, who will also respond and react to the book's findings and give his perspectives on reform efforts as a senior policy fellow here at the Urban Institute. Jesse has directed several large multi-site or multi-state projects on police-community relations and community violence reduction initiatives, and has thought deeply about the role of training and technical assistance as a mechanism to drive meaningful system change, given his role as a developer of TTA models and leading that work in several justice reform change projects. So with that as context, let me turn it over to Michael to set the stage for us here. Give us a little bit about what you've learned in writing and researching your book, and what you think generally about the culture of policing and police reform efforts locally and nationally.
Sure.
The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. I appreciate that. And thank you all of you for being here today. It's a lovely day in DC. There's other things you could be doing right now. And you're in here with us. So thank you. I'll try to make it worth your while as best I can. In In broad strokes, I set out to understand the how and why of police violence, like a whole generation of scholars who are now getting tenure, who are going up soon. The police killing of Michael Brown fundamentally shifted my focus in 2014. At the time, I was doing work in violence reduction, and I had grand plans of doing an ethnography of Project Longevity in New Haven, Connecticut, which is a focused deterrence initiative. So I was going to spend time with the young men that were part of the program, talk to the judges, talk to prosecutors, talk to officers, talk to social service providers. I do still think that's a reasonably good project. But Michael Brown's killing shifted me to think about policing. And it's sometimes difficult to remember that in 2014, we didn't yet have Washington Post that counted. We didn't have some of these data sets that we now take for granted. And so I'm 24 at the time, and I simply cannot understand how it's possible that we don't collect data on who gets shot by the police. It just didn't make any sense to me. So I began reading more about police data, and I find out that we don't even have particularly good estimates of how many officers there are. At the time, the census of law enforcement agencies was already something like 5 or 6 years out of date. We have a new instantiation of that survey, and that one is already now, I think, at least half a decade out of date. The UCR is not great. And so I just kept learning about all these data sets that we had, and to be very blunt, they were not great. And at the same time, I found these classic ethnographies of policing from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, the thing that policing scholarship is built on. And so that was sort of the aha, was, well, I don't think I can answer my questions on the how and why of police violence with a survey or with these administrative records. So I'll get in a car. I'll do what they did a couple decades ago, and I'll see if there's something else to learn. And I began with questions about police suicide. I had found the statistics that 5 to 6 times as many officers kill themselves every year as are killed feloniously in the line of duty, but nobody wanted to talk to me about suicide. And then I talked about community policing, maybe. That was something that was in vogue at the time, as it is every couple decades. And I just got boilerplate answers. I got basically the website quoted back to me about why we do community policing and how great it is and how important it is. But then I did what a good ethnographer should do, which is I let officers tell me what mattered to them. And so as I began asking questions about why they chose to do things this way, why they stood here, why they parked here, why did you separate these people, the answer, almost without exception, was officer safety, officer safety, officer safety. And seemingly everything in their world could be tied somehow back to officer safety. And so I began in Elmont on the East Coast, and then I eventually added West River on the West Coast and Sunshine in the Southwest. These are all pseudonyms for these departments. They're all large urban departments. I spent over 1,000 hours in the field, the vast majority of which were spent in a car with officers, interviewed over 100 of them at all levels, chiefs, training instructors, patrol officers, field training officers, rookies, veterans, men, women, black, white. I just talked to as many people as I possibly could. And by the time I was finished, I came up with the topic, the concept of what I call the danger imperative. And this is, sociologists call it a cultural frame. The simpler way is it's a lens, it's a filter. We all have lenses and filters that we use to move through our world, to simplify things around us. You have different lenses when you're in school. You have different lenses when you're at work. You have different lenses when you're at home. Officers have their own frame, the danger imperative, which I argue is focused on the preoccupation with violence and the necessity of ensuring officer safety at all times. And so the book argues that this frame is formally colorblind. It does not make explicit mention about race. It does not make explicit mention of profiling people based on race, but it uses these ostensibly neutral terms: safety, threat, danger, weapons. And that is the power of the danger imperative, is that it does not make explicit mention of these things. It doesn't need to. The rest of the system stays as it is. And so officers moving through their world learn that they must ensure their safety at all times, and to do otherwise is entertaining disaster. And so what I argue in the book from chapter 1 through 4, this is not something that they just learn in the academy. It's not downloaded like software. It begins in the academy, but it's actually recreated every single day in the police department. It's recreated on the walls that memorialize dead officers. It is inked into their skin. It is on T-shirts. It is in their daily lineup meetings, and it is also in how they move through the world and observe other officers move through the world. This is not a story of downloading culture. It's a story of recreating culture every single day. And so Jocelyn talked about training. I do have some thoughts on things that we could do with training to maybe mitigate some of the sharpest edges of the danger imperative. But I think the book is very much an invitation to question the wisdom of believing that we're going to train our way out of this. This is not something that, even if you had the best possible training, will shift the rest of the institution. Training doesn't change Graham v. Connor, doesn't change the reasonable officer standard, doesn't change qualified immunity, it doesn't change indemnification. This is much bigger than individual departments, and it's certainly bigger than the quote-unquote bad apples. I think that's a good start, yeah.
Thank you. So I'll turn it over to you, Walter, to respond to anything that Michael invites us to do, particularly in your perspective and role as trying to engage in police reform efforts in Chicago and other places.
Well, thank you, Jocelyn, and thanks for having me here today. You know, Michael's book was really compelling, and it really spoke to me because throughout, for me, it was a callback to a lot of the work that I have done in my career. And just to very briefly encapsulate it, and that provides the context for a lot of what I'm going to say, is I began my career in Southern California as a public defender. So first in San Diego County and then in Los Angeles County. And as a relatively young misdemeanor public defender handling misdemeanor cases, I do recall the very first resisting a peace officer case that was assigned to me in California. That's Penal Code 148, and a 148 has a very certain meaning to it. And I just, you know, and this was an incident which happened at a wedding party. As a guest to a wedding party, he may or may not have had too much to drink, but the law enforcement agency was called out, and an officer came, and the incident quickly escalated and was so clearly devolved into, after the fact, in court, into this difference in interpretation of what took place. And very clearly, the officer viewed my client as a threat. And that theme then continued through my work as a public defender. And then in 2010, I began the next chapter of my career, which was in law enforcement oversight. And that's where I was part of an office which had oversight of a very large sheriff's agency in California. And that is really where I started having a front row seat in policing culture. As a public defender, I was very involved in the aftermath of a scandal that struck LAPD called the Rampart crash scandal, where a unit of gang officers in the Rampart division have been abusing the constitutional rights of residents in the MacArthur Park neighborhood, almost exclusively Spanish-speaking residents, because, as they said during the deposition, they were less likely to complain than black residents. So that's why they targeted them. But my work in oversight, where I had a front row seat, what that meant is that, like Michael, I was in ride-alongs. I went through defensive tactics training. I went through shooting drills. I'd be out in the range. I really wanted to learn how did they do that work. And you hear this theme. You hear these common themes which shows up throughout Michael's book, no matter which agency he was observing, which is officer safety is the consistent theme. That the theme you hear time and time again of your number one job is to go home that night. So how you're enculturated, how you're trained in the academy, how the field training works, how your field training officer instills in a young officer how safety comes first. The small things, the big things that they do is all built around officer safety. And there is a reason for that. And so my role in police oversight was, when I was on call, was responding out to shooting scenes where officer-involved shootings took place and other in-custody deaths. So in my career, I estimate I probably attended about 24 fatal police shootings. That included being on scene as an extended barricade situation where I heard a shooting took place. It involved reviewing, serious uses of force, and then the whole investigation and review process. And so I'd see this theme emerge time and time again about officer safety. But on the other hand, though, and I'm not even sure what's on the other hand, but it goes into the context. The theme which Michael talks about in his book, which really becomes clear, I think it was in chapter 3, about the culture of death, the culture of risk of death. You know, in my career, being oversight or then in Chicago mayor's office, I think I've attended 6, maybe 7 officer funerals. When I was in Chicago, a police commander was murdered about 500 feet away from my office. You know, I kept his voicemail. I knew him. I kept his voicemail on my city-issued cell phone. Never deleted it. I went with the mayor to his home to see the family the day after he was murdered. We've had widows who visited the mayor with their infant child who never knew their father because he was murdered or died while his wife was pregnant. These things are poignant and they're real. And what the theme which emerges in Michael's book, my own personal experience, is that, well, I think every town estimates there are about 394 million guns in circulation. Every year, about 30,000 guns are stolen and enter the illicit marketplace. Traffic stops account for about 20% of all felonious deaths of police officers. So it is not, and Michael's clear about this, it's not that the fear is unfounded. It is how is that fear of violence, of death enculturated, and how is the response defined? So I'll stop there, but I think what Michael did was an extraordinarily important contribution to the understanding of how policing works within American culture and the criminal justice system.
Please, Jesse.
So, Michael, I want to congratulate you on a great book, and part of how I know it's great is in reading it, it had me rethinking so many things that I've worked on and seen and processing them with a different lens and conceptual vocabulary. So I want to pick up on this question of reform and culture. I was thinking a lot as I read your book about work that I was part of, that Jocelyn was also part of, doing evaluation of an effort called the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. This was a 6-city demonstration project funded out of the Obama-era Justice Department, intended to go directly at the issue of deep mistrust, and I would say mutual mistrust between law enforcement and many communities, but with a particular focus on that relationship and lack of trust from Black communities in the United States. We were doing that work at essentially the same time. Michael, that you were embedded with the 3 police departments. And in the course of that evaluation, something I heard over and over again in some of the qualitative work from a lot of people outside the police department on the community side, but also from many within law enforcement, was this is about culture. And in fact, you know, I had multiple people from police departments who were involved in the effort say in almost exactly the same terms, culture is the whole game. You know, if we're going to try and do what we're trying to do here, it has to affect culture. And I think that raises the question of whether some of the reform levers that we maybe pulled most often, whether it be training, whether it be changing policies, whether it be oversight, whether it be legislation, how effectively can they, do we know how to put them together to go after changes in organizational culture, which is very challenging. Now, the way that some of the officers that were involved, and you know, I found myself thinking a lot about an experience I had where I was observing, they brought together the training teams, because there was a very forward training component of this, really built on the spine of procedural justice, which, if you're not familiar, is, I guess I would define it as sort of an array of tools for exercising authority in a way that, you know, creates legitimacy for that authority around things like treating people with respect, giving them voice in encounters, being transparent about why you're doing what you're doing. And so the departments had picked training teams, some of whom were involved in the training operation, but many of whom were not, to borrow a term from maybe another field. They were really looking for credible messengers, people who would come in, who could stand at the front of a room full of officers and have credibility about what they were talking about. And they were there learning the concepts and the training they'd apply, but also interrogating them, not, I would say, in a hostile way, but they really wanted to get under what was there and whether it would, in fact, convince them that it was good for their departments. And they, in those rooms, I heard for the first time that I had a lot of phrases that were in your book. The polling of the room, what's the number one priority when you go out, is to come home. That's where I first heard the phrase, better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. But what they were doing, I think, among other things, is they recognized how primary in many ways this officer safety frame was, and that anything that was going to land and potentially change the way that officers were showing up everywhere they show up and interacting with the public had to fit alongside that, not a substitute, but a complement. It's how I would say they were approaching that. And one of the through lines that they drew in that and spent a lot of time with is talking about some of what we know about how corrosive, to use a word that I heard them use there, being a police officer can be to health in many ways. We know, and Michael's book talks about this, police officers have much greater risk of suicide and suicidal ideation than the general population. Also things like elevated levels by some measure of problematic alcohol use and things like that. And they, there were a lot of candid conversations there about the psychic toll that consistent hypervigilance plays, how hard it is to climb down from that when you're spending, a lot of time in that state. And again, not necessarily critiquing it as inappropriate or that it's not necessary, but trying to think about how you might complicate and maybe put some other frameworks alongside that focus on safety or the danger imperative, as Michael has, and have it take a place in policing so that the way that officers are showing up and engaging with the public and engaging with neighborhoods might present a face that would mitigate some of those dynamics that may be contributing and creating some of the risks that they fear. The last thing that I did want to say that I thought about very strongly in reading Michael's book, and this is sort of on an other side, but coming out of some of the work around community violence and gun violence, we were engaged to do some work by a city that wanted to understand how they might be able to improve the experiences that people were having interacting with police officers at homicide and shooting scenes. Actually, interestingly, one of the things they were interested in doing is thinking with them about whether procedural justice might be a vehicle for that. And we had the opportunity, our team did, to talk to people who had survived being shot or people who had lost a loved one to gun violence about the experience they had interacting with police. And we heard a lot of things, and there were some positive experiences. Some people did say that officers met them with empathy, recognition, support, expressions of care, which is what they were really so strongly looking for as they described it. But others described, that they were met with sometimes rudeness, brusqueness, preoccupation, or even interrogation. And I think in reading Michael's book, it's almost like you're seeing what are some of the things that were in the consideration set of officers when they're showing up there. Really, I think, vividly presented, but I just cannot say enough how much people that had those experiences that felt they were met with suspicion at this moment where they had been traumatized by what had either directly happened to them or someone around them, how damaging and re-traumatizing that was. And, when the police show up, which is really the government showing up at that moment, it does activate a lot of what the people we're talking to described as a sense that what happens to us, our lives, the harm that happens to us does not matter. We do not believe to society, to the government, to the police in the same way that other people's harm matters to them, and that's tremendously corrosive. And many things feed into that, but I think what, Michael, you're naming as the danger imperative, I think certainly feeds into that in some ways.
Thank you all for putting a lot on the table for us to think about. And so it's going to feel a little uncomfortable as I'll just pick up on a couple of those threads. I can't sort of address all of them in the time that we have here. But I want to go back to this central point of culture and what you said, Michael, which I think is pretty provocative, but also quite simple, right, is that questioning this wisdom, that we can train our way out of it. And certainly we all know culture is not something that is either formed overnight or that can be changed overnight. So I just want to put that back on to you to sort of, we can't train our way out of that, but, and Jesse is also saying, can we even, policy and practice change, is that sort of enough as to, so we've identified a problem, and what do you think are some of the solutions to that, and the tools that we are currently use or have on the table, or others that we perhaps haven't thought about or done sufficiently enough of?
Sure. I think that question dovetails well with Walter's observation, and thank you for noting that I did take the time to try and explain that these simplistic characterizations of, well, policing doesn't result in as many deaths as pizza delivery drivers and electricians. It's simplistic. It makes for clickbaity op-eds, but it's just simplistic. Because it turns out when you change it from deaths to violent deaths, it's not close. Officers are violently killed and violently assaulted at rates far higher than any other profession. And myself and some colleagues have looked at firearm deaths specifically, and it's much higher than even the general public are assaulted with firearms. That is true. And at the same time, it's also true that this claim of a war on cops, of unprecedented levels of violence and unprecedented deaths since Michael Brown's killing, is just empirically untrue. It is a story of consistency, and the trend is not one of rapidly increasing violence. There are small temporal variations, and each one of those shootings and deaths is important. But it turns out something can be more common than the rarest and still be relatively rare. Those two things can be true at the same time. But to Walter's point, it is dangerous. And I try to take special care in the book not to portray officers' view of the world as one that is utterly irrational. This is a country that is more dangerous for a police officer than it is in the UK, than in Germany, than in Wales, and other OECD peer nations. And that is just empirically true. What I think it does allow us to do is to pay that credence and understand that this worldview has metastasized into something else, that this is the emphasis on danger for its own sake. And it has been provided now moral standing within the institution, and any desire or inclination to try to question that particular position is tantamount to saying that you want officers to be hurt or killed. That is not an environment that is conducive to self-reflection, that is conducive to improvement, that is conducive much less to reform. And that, I think, is the sticky nature of culture. I don't think you can change culture with training in a really meaningful way, because while I can do procedural justice training or de-escalation training, and there is some preliminary evidence that those things can have a behavioral effect, the effects are small. We don't know how long they last. They tend to be quite expensive. It doesn't change the 400 million firearms. It doesn't change segregation and redlining. It doesn't change structural disinvestment that is the root cause of racism that officers are part of in this system. And so that's why I emphasize the danger imperative is colorblind. It actually doesn't require bad apples. It doesn't require immoral, racist officers to perpetuate these systemic inequalities. Now, the system very much is designed to protect those officers in many cases, as we know. But I think the story is much scarier if you think that you can take the most well-meaning officer and put them in a system that then recreates itself in the name of safety. And I think that's the system that I describe. And so training, I think, is not a bad idea. I'm not saying don't do training. I'm just saying that the emphasis on training, I think, limits our ability to understand what other options there might be. I think it gives a very convenient checkbox to police executives. Well, we did the training. It's a part of a consent decree. Yeah, but we did the training. Like, we're good now. We took out all the warrior stuff, so we're good now. And I think instead, I'm more interested in just recognizing the institution for what it is. That is one of the key conclusions of the book. If you're not familiar with policing, policing is violent. That's the whole point. And if you took away the guns and the sticks and the legal protections to use violence, it might be something else, but it wouldn't be policing. And the US is not unique in these. Lots of countries have police that are empowered to use violence. But the violence is the point. And so I think that's a different place to begin our conversation, is that we're spending all this time trying to make policing something that it is not. Policing is violent. And so I'm interested in thinking about solutions to officer safety and public safety simultaneously. Very much those problems are now thought of as completely separate things. And officers get badges and qualified immunity and guns and Granby Connor, and they are told to provide for their safety on the street. And then public safety is something that they also do, but is somehow separate from officer safety. I think that I would love to see IACP and the FOP and large departments be on board with solutions that we can do environmentally, that can reduce violence on streets where Black people and brown people spend their time, and so do officers. I think that we can reduce violence in places for everyone, and that doesn't require the police to change their culture. It doesn't require them to change their training. It doesn't require me to fix the gun problem. By the way, I think they're staying, so I'm not sure how useful that conversation is. I think that we can do simple things like improve lighting. I think we can do simple things like green vacant lots and fix the facades of dilapidated buildings. I think we can do simple things like planting trees, which some evidence suggests could reduce violence by reducing the ambient temperature of cities. A recent paper shows that if you increase the number of behavioral health treatment centers in a county, you can reduce the number of assaults specifically on police officers. Nothing that I just mentioned requires you to change police culture. But it's not something that I think policing is behind. I don't think they call for it. I don't think they're advocating for those things. And so I'd like to know the answer from police leaders, why? Why don't you support actively these measures that could very well save the lives of your officers and don't require you to do more work and don't require you to do different training?
You have an answer to that, right, Walter? No,
Yeah,
not that specific
yeah.
question, but I
But
want to throw
may.
something out. I
Right.
want to hear from you, and another thing I want to sort of throw into the conversation, because I know that you've thought a lot about this, which is the potential for reforms, which is within policing, and we can take some of the things that Michael has talked about, but also reforms that just reduce the overall sort of footprint and scope of policing in this country so that I guess there's less of that violence in communities if we're coming up with alternatives to police responses. So in your response, can you throw
Yeah.
your thoughts about that in there too?
Right, and you know, there's no one from law enforcement here in this panel, and nor is anyone here pretending to be, but I think one thing we'd hear in response is that environmental measures or measures for mental health treatment centers or alternative response models don't solve for, and this is a phrase you hear in policing all the time, the bad guy problem. The one who, the readiness to do evil, the person who's driving around with a gun in their car, who has essentially a hair trigger, who during a traffic stop will be willing to, you know, pull out their weapon and start shooting, right? And I think police officers would say, well, fine, we can put in more street lighting, we can have more programming, but that doesn't solve necessarily for the risk that that officer is taking every day. And this conversation contains so many paradoxes, right? You have the paradox that relative to all police encounters, there are very few fatalities caused by the police. There are about 52,000 traffic stops that occur every single day, right? About 1,000 people are killed by the police every year, regardless of reforms. Reforms since 2014, reforms since 2020, the number's still about the same. I checked this morning on the most up-to-date data from mapping police violence. And according to MPV's website, so far this year, there have been 433 killings by police. Of those 433, I believe 23 of the people were believed to be completely unarmed. Of the ones who were armed, every single one of them were shot as the means of death, right? And we also know that as of this today, about 23 officers have been killed feloniously on duty so far this year, right? Now, if law enforcement were here, they would say that's 23. Say, well, that's rare. And, so the question is, does rarity mean that officers should then discount officer safety? And I think what you said is really important, that no matter what the policy is we're talking about, police always fall back on, yes, but will it undermine officer safety? That has to be the given. And the way that policing works politically for, 95%, I'm throwing that number out, of percent plus of mayors and other policymakers, they will not argue against the concept of officer safety. In other words, if law enforcement says this particular policy will make us less safe, then the reflex will be, then we will not do this policy unless there's a strong reason not to. So, so I'm not trying to rain on the parade, but I'm really concerned that if we are concerned about officers using too much force in public, and this is discretionary force, that finding solutions is going to be extraordinarily difficult. There's some ideas how to do it, but I think if we're going to actually bring that number down to less than 1,000 a year, let's say even 700 a year, it's going to be very hard to do.
Jesse, I'd like for you to sort of continue this thread, which is both how do we think about, understand, what more do we need to know about, both within policing reforms that are trying to get at this culture, limited as we know they might be, as well as sort of alternatives to policing responses that may reduce the sort of like overall footprint of policing, as well as reduce the amount of or communities that are being exposed to the violence. And I say all of that, and I should have said this before, within the context of still keeping communities safe. So I don't mean to suggest that we just have less overall for the sake of it. And as you're thinking, sorry, I was just told, reminder to folks to put questions in the Q&A box, because I will be turning to you in about 15 minutes. Sir.
Yeah, so a lot there. I mean, one, and I think, Michael put this on the table and touched on it. I mean, one place a lot of people then go with this is like, well, one thing you can do is just find every opportunity to just create less police contact and less police presence, in communities. And so that you got a lot of places. So whether it's been changing things to reduce the degree to which law enforcement is handling traffic stops or traffic enforcement. This is, I think, a lot of the promise and the motivation that people say around rolling out like purely alternative responses to people in mental health crisis. So not just co-responder models, but models that don't involve the police rolling out, like just, are there ways we could just have there fewer interactions so that even if the culture doesn't change and all of these things are held constant, there are less opportunities for a situation to go bad in an interesting way. I mean, that is from a very different angle, people picking up a form of what, police are putting down when they're talking about how dangerous any of these interactions can be. I do, and this is very early and a little bit speculative, so I'm not sure how much we'd really need to look into what the possibilities are here. But one of the things is very intrigued by a finding mentioned in some work that my colleagues are doing looking at evaluation around co-response in Denver, where they were mentioning that, there's in the qualitative conversations that they've had, you'd want to substantiate that, some evidence that working with co-responders is altering what police do and how they do it to some degree, even when the co-responders aren't there. And the reason that I pick up on this is as a potentially fruitful contribution to this conversation is one of the things that does tend to change cultures maybe is when they come into contact in a meaningful way with other cultures. In other words, policing can be, I think, I mean, many professions are, but policing can be quite an insular profession in many ways. That's one of the things that makes the culture of it so strong. And when you have a situation where you're working alongside somebody from a very different professional culture with a different professional toolkit that thinks about risk and danger in a different way, that could also be potentially influential. I think a lot of these things probably need to be both and, because these are all like pieces of, trying to reduce harm done to communities in various ways by policing while trying to maintain the safety benefit that police provide and have strong safety work in general. And another one that I would mention from work that I've done around community violence interventions, it's been very interesting the way some people in law enforcement who are not necessarily working in close collaboration with violence interrupters or people doing street outreach, because in many cases there's a professional understanding that too close a working relationship there can undermine the ability of interrupters and street outreach professionals to do that work, because it relies on trust in communities. But they're working alongside each other. They're going to a lot of the same, scenes in response. They're out in a lot of the same places. And I do think that there is, among the self-selecting group of officers that do work and engage around that kind of work, professional understanding and respect there that I think is also part of learning different ways. And, violence interruption is also a dangerous profession that involves going into situations that are quite dangerous deliberately. I mean, very different than policing, but in that basic way, not dissimilar. And so I wonder if there's possibility for more interdisciplinary connection with different kinds of parts of the safety workforce. That's already happening. It's been happening for a long time. And that growing that may create less police interaction in general. It may also create different ways of thinking. Again, that's not going to transform police culture, but I think it is a venue for supplementing ways of thinking about that kinds of work that are worth at least paying attention to what can be done there.
So I want to pick up on the interplay between officer safety and community safety. And I sort of want to hear from all three of you about, do you think that sort of messages or having better or different conversations with officers where they understand that these things play together and that that we should be thinking about safety on both sides, whether you think that that's a fruitful way to getting at some of the culture and reducing the danger imperative, or does that seem in some ways naive or too simplistic?
If I knew for sure, I would have already tweeted it.
Okay.
That said, I don't want to be too cynical about the possibility of changing hearts and minds. I think that there will always be value in trying to seek understanding on the part of officers and on the part of community members, because we're all going to keep being here. That is kind of the table stakes. We're going to keep being part of this thing that we call society. I think that where I arrived at by the time I finished the book was sort of a pragmatic realism around the danger imperative is also unlikely to go anywhere. Again, I think that there are various ways that, as I described in the book, blunt its sharpest edges. I think that you should remove Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman's killology stuff from training documents. I think you should stop using tax dollars to send officers to these very poorly vetted trainings. I do think that we should have de-escalation. All of those things are true. Do I think that's going to fundamentally change it? No. And so at the same time, I think that having conversation and trying to have officers understand that there are people that do actually like them a lot. In fact, police are generally very popular with lots of people, despite the rhetoric of the war on cops and defund and abolish. The average person still actually trusts the police, wants the police to come when they call 911, et cetera. I think that there might be value there, but what I don't think is a reasonable expectation is that coffee with a cop essentially is going to change these underlying cultural assumptions about the work.
I think it's really important, and this is something which, has come up time and time again, is data collection and data transparency. It's not for the sake of data. It's to have a better understanding of when violence occurs, when fatal use of force occurs. And part of it is also, I think, listening both to police officers and also people who come into encounters with the police. There's a qualitative and a quantitative aspect to it. If we were to have a better ability to really disentangle in what situations is it where a police officer is most likely to use a significant amount of force, fatal or serious injury causing force, and we have a better understanding of those particular circumstances. If we also look at which are the circumstances where the officer is at the greatest risk, and I'm pretty confident I know what those are. Domestic violence calls, warrants, traffic stops, and then fourth would be ambushes, which are really, really rare. But if you talk to police officers, they will say that the most dangerous kind of calls that they do are domestic violence calls. Confined spaces, really volatile emotions. They are inside somebody's residence. They have no idea where weapons could be. And if you look at controversial uses of force, often they occur in that very setting. A police officer arrives, he thinks he sees something, he shoots through an open window and kills the resident inside. There's a calls for service, he sees somebody with a knife, and the person's upset, maybe intoxicated, they're emotionally upset, they throw an object towards an officer, and the officers, rather than using their taser because they left it in the glove box, opened fire and they kill the person. That's a shooting I actually rolled out in California, which was just a real head scratcher. So we, I think, need to really dig into when do these instances occur and be actually really surgical about understanding the circumstances behind them and do a couple of things. We've already talked about improving training. We've already talked about data collection. Training, we need to be far more expansive rather than just a physical training, but also think about the decision-making type of training. Mm-hmm. There's some interesting research out there. For example, a new training method called situational decision-making, which was piloted in Chicago, which I find really intriguing. I think there's other areas we could be looking at in terms of how officers de-escalate, how they perceive threat. And then after an incident takes place, not only do we need an accountable system so that an officer does use excessive force is held accountable, but we also need to think about it more systemically by using methodologies like sentinel events review or human factors analysis. We do not necessarily treat a police cause fatality the same way they would treat an air collision or an air fatality, and we should. There's often factors, including culture, including fear, drive decision-making that occurs, and those need to be peeled apart to have a better understanding. So I do think it's a combination of being more expansive of how we think about decision-making, how we think about what effect policies could have, identifying at-risk behaviors, at-risk contexts and circumstances, and thinking through how we can make them safer. That includes domestic violence calls, that includes serving warrants, it includes those other situations where the likelihood of a police officer or a civilian being killed are higher than average.
Jesse?
So thinking about coming back to the question of community engagement, I think there is some possibilities there. One of the things that I've seen in various forums that I think is worth pursuing is maybe a little bit more focused ability for police to engage and get a better sense of the costs of some of what they do. I was thinking, Michael, as Jocelyn was asking the question about an incident that was in your book about where the officers were pursuing a vehicle that matched the description of one that involved in an armed robbery. The suspect was, whoever was driving it was understood to be armed. They got the wrong car, took the person a little while to pull over, and like they affected the stop. There were guns drawn, all the occupants of the car, at least the driver, they were cuffed, right? If I'm recalling correctly,
No,
or
it was,
they had weapons
it
pointed
was
at
two
them.
young children
Yeah.
and 3 innocent people. The officers couldn't know this when they pulled the car over. I was there. You can't see inside of the car many times. And in short, once they had the first woman come out of the car, you know, high-risk traffic stop, hands on the back of your head, turn around, lift up your shirt, see the waistband. Officer comes up and tells the lieutenant, I think this isn't them. Like, should we bring it down? Meaning, treat this as a normal traffic stop now. At which point they did. That lieutenant then goes to the car and does what, by the books, is like a perfectly procedurally just interaction, which was, this is what happened, just so you know, we got a call, it was an armed robbery, the description was of a blue BMW. At this point, he kind of puts his hands out like, blue BMW. And so just to let you know, like, that's why this happened, so, you know, et cetera.
And, you know, it's my sense from the book as you're describing is a sense like, oh, well, nothing bad happened from the perspective of the officers, but of course you have guns pointed at you, like that is something real bad happened to you that day. And I do think that, you know, and this takes a lot of forms, but I think, you know, in engagements that I've had with officers around some of these issues, sometimes there's a sense of maybe not fully absorbing that, like, if a police officer comes to your house and yells at you, like that's a very intense intervention. You know, like there are costs to these things, and those have to be weighed against other things that police have to consider. But I do think if you're going to create some engagement that's in an open way with people that have been, you know, experience that kind of police interaction, I do think, not for every officer, but that can have some real power. It's challenging in these things to get into the question of sufficiency, because do I think that would be sufficient? No, but I do think that it is something that is worth doing, and that is different than some of the things like Coffee with a Cop that sort of create connections with whoever is inclined to come and speak to officers, which does a very different thing. The other thing I'll put on the table, though, and this is something that came out in the National Initiative and other things, that may, how you set that up, you may need to think about whether that's a two-way street. And what I mean by that is one of the first things some of the officers that were doing the procedural justice training stuff said is like, oh, when's the community going to get trained? And I do think I've encountered a lot of times in trust building things here, the sense from officers that we have a lot of things we think the community needs to know about how they need to conduct themselves when they're engaging with us, and however you feel about it, that is a place that I've seen that question of community engagement and who needs to know what go. And I mean, there's certainly a lot of ways you could have that come into a conversation that could be pretty explosive, but that's, you know, that's, all these things have the potential to be a two-way street, and there are a lot of things that I know officers want to ask the community or tell them or educate them. That comes up a lot in the context where I've engaged with police.
Thank you so much. Such an incredibly rich discussion. We scratched the surface of so many things. I wish we had more time. But I'm now going to turn it to the audience, and I think I understand that I have everyone's questions here. No, so some folks who are here, you can raise your hand and someone will come to you. So as you're thinking about that, I'm going to go to a question from our audience, and in some ways it starts or sort of as a continuation of something that you were just talking about, Jesse, and I'd like for you to respond to this, Michael, which is, if, you know, policing reflects the culture of violence, one would think that the display of violence would be the same across populations, and so talk a little bit more about the racial disparities that are in police use of force and sort of these interactions and what we know is undermines legitimacy in communities sort of generally, but certainly in Black and brown communities in particular. So,
for sure. So one of the key points, particularly at the front end of the book, where I kind of set out the theory of what the danger imperative is that this frame is formally colorblind. And like the next page is where I explain, but we also know that racism is real and implicit biases are real. And there's an experimental work showing that there are these implicit cognitive biases where threat, suspicion, criminality, violence are associated with people of color, specifically young Black men. So I take that actually as given. That is just true. The reason why I spent so much time trying to think about what the implications of a colorblind frame were was because, again, policing is one piece of a very big puzzle of structural racism. Police are part of this system, hospitals and schools and banks And everything else is wrapped up in this broader system of racial inequality that perpetuates over time. And so the reason why the color blindness component is important is because it allows me to engage in an important thought exercise, which is, let's say that I had a perfect filtering mechanism for the racist officers, the really bad cops, the closeted white supremacists that are not flying their colors, and I could just remove them entirely. I have not changed anything else about the system except the individual officers within policing. I have not changed segregation. I have not changed redlining. I have not changed inequalities in health. I have not changed inequalities in education. I have not changed anything else. Will I still be systematically funneling officers, often called by 911, into the same places? Yes. So even if I assume that I have perfectly aracial, egalitarian, biasless officers, if they are operating through the frame of the danger imperative, when there are mistakes, errors, they will happen in those places systematically as a function of arithmetic, not because of individual bias necessarily. Now, of course, that's a thought experiment. I also know that those biases are real, and racist cops do exist, and they are sometimes protected by the institution. And so this is a way of trying to articulate that racial inequality and police violence, and I don't just mean shootings, I mean pushing someone up against a wall, I mean putting a gun at the low ready, not pointing it, but drawing it, crackling a taser instead of shooting it. All of those things are violence, all of them. And those things do not depend on overt racial animus, but that overt racial animus is very much something that can be conducted through the danger imperative, and importantly, justified in completely aracial terms in the name of safety.
If I could add to that, if you don't mind. And the challenge of that is, by trying to treat it like it's aracial, that it actually ignores the reality. And so often, the most egregious example of police killings are where black men are in spaces where they're perhaps not supposed to be, right? Jonathan Farrell, who was killed by the police in North Carolina in 2014, his car broke down. He was knocking on somebody's door to look for help, and she called the police, and he got shot and killed. Jonathan Crawford was in a Walmart playing with a pellet gun when a police officer was called to the scene, and he shot and killed John Crawford, who had nothing but a pellet gun in his head. Elijah McClain was a block from his house. The simply walking home was viewed as being weird, ended up dead. You know, you can go on and on, where the victims of the danger imperative are invariably going to be black men and young black men and brown men. And so what the problem is, by treating it aracial, it actually then creates cover. What I know when I was police oversight, we got plenty of complaints where people perceive they're being treated in a disparate fashion. They're a victim of racism by a particular police officer. And as my role as the police auditor in San Jose, or before that where I worked elsewhere in police oversight, there's never once a sustained finding of discriminatory policing, because there never was an explicit statement of bias during that encounter. The system is infused with implicit, unspoken biases. And so therefore, if a child is playing in a Cleveland playground with a toy gun and you show up and you shoot and kill that child within 5 seconds, you don't have to tell me anything other than that for me to know that the child was black, right? And so ultimately, it all comes back to race. And the cover of treating it aracially, which is not saying you are, but how the system is. Graham versus Connor is aracial. It then keeps on providing cover for these very clear biases that are in the system. And that is what we need to be focusing on if we want to solve for these abhorrent deaths that occur.
Thank you, Walter. I think we have a question in the audience here in the room.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this great session. One thing, and I apologize if this was mentioned and I missed it. One thing I haven't heard mentioned is anything relative to gun control and whether or not that would have any potential impact on the danger imperative if there was this belief that there were fewer guns on the streets.
Shall I take it away?
Yeah.
I did mention it briefly, which is essentially to say that I'm super skeptical that it's going to happen at the federal level. I think that there is something to be said for the theory that, you know what, if we actually could drastically reduce how many guns there were, this might change the structural conditions that justify the danger imperative, that speak to the very real threat that energizes that culture. I think, however, I temper that optimism with the fact that part of why I got into this project in the first place was because I heard all this rhetoric about war on cops. I started talking to officers where they were saying it was more dangerous than ever, and it's just not true. So it seems to be a culture that is built on premises that are actually highly resistant to empirical reality. I have talked to officers, and I've done my nerdy sociology thing where I explain it's 1 in 65 million, I believe, traffic stops that result in a fatality. The probability of you killing yourself with your duty weapon is far higher than getting killed on patrol. They do odd things like not wear their seatbelt in the name of safety so they can get to their firearms or get out of the car quickly. That is, again, probabilistically highly irrational, and it doesn't matter. It is irrelevant because the cost of incorrectly addressing what they believe to be the most salient threat to their lives, being a firearm in the hands of someone that wants to hurt them, the cost of that done incorrectly is infinitely high. And to their credit, they are not technically, in a mathematical sense, wrong when they say it could be any stop. It could be any interaction. It's, statistically speaking, pretty close to zero, but it's not zero. And that's all that has to be true.
Do we? And then I'll go back to the.
I can just project.
She can come to you.
I was curious when coming in whether the focus of this was going to be a discussion of reforming police function or of the culture of policing. It's a little unclear to me still. I've read anecdotally that much local police recruitment comes from people recently discharged from the military, and there's a sense in which it's a logical move from military experience into policing. It's been a long time since I had that experience. I don't think it equates necessarily. So much has been said, so much, I think I only have a minute. All of us will have occasion to remember a slogan from years ago, support your local police. And where I live, there's a very strong pro-police segment of the community, which questions any questions raised about policing in our local community. And one of the refrains is, of course, the police officer puts his job on the line every day, which I think follows the imperative you're referring to. And yet, we honor them for that. And it seems very frequently that the first instinct of that police officer whom we would honor is to defend her or himself at the expense of the community, which is what they're theoretically hired and trained and responsible for doing. So I thought I heard a little note of pessimism about reforming the culture, but I think that reforming that culture is necessary. Finally, however many people are in this room or online today, this is a discussion that should occur in every town and city hall in America, and I'd like the four of you to go on a roadshow and engage many, many more people in this discussion.
Thank you for that. Would you like to respond to any of you, to what the gentleman said? And then another thing that I want to throw into the conversation, what we got from the audience is just what is the role of officer unions and other sort of the context in which police officers sort of sit? How do we think about what's necessary to reforming those functions and that context in order to sort of reduce the danger imperative?
Can we start with 30 unions?
Okay, I'll pick up on that though.
All right, great.
Something to say.
So to the gentleman's comment about, I think you're referring to what there's a nascent discussion around the hierarchy of life in policing. And, I don't think I don't really believe in coincidence. It's National Police Week. The memorial was on Monday at the Capitol. There are officers that sacrifice themselves incredibly selflessly in defense of innocent people. They are real heroes. But the reason why those heroes are so special is because that's not actually most officers. Most officers are regular people doing a very special job. And I think that what the danger imperative reflects for me, and what I have mentioned earlier about not all violence is shootings, is that in practice, the ideal of heroic sacrifice for the public, I think on average is more often in practice about officers ensuring their safety in order to then ensure the safety of everybody else. Now, I've never seen that formally expressed in training documents. I've never seen that formally written on a wall or on the side of a patrol car. But I do think that in conversations with officers, they've made very clear that the first thing I have to take care of before I do anything else is to make sure that myself and other officers are okay. That doesn't preclude officers showing rare acts of true heroism, running into burning buildings, sacrificing themselves for students. Those things happen. But this is a system that is much bigger than those instances. And I think on average, officers learn that the practical reality of policing is ensuring their well-being, even if at times it comes at the expense of the feelings, much less the actual well-being of the people with whom they're interacting. And now unions, Walton.
So, yeah, unions have a significant part to play, and you wrote about that extensively in your book about the role of police unions and how they can politicize issues and be a bulwark against reform. And I think anyone in any profession would wish they had a union which so aggressively defended the interests of their workers. And I've written about police unions a couple of years ago in a law review article on the premise that too often collective bargaining, which enshrines a lot of those protections for officers, accountability protections, due process protections, are negotiated between the union and the city. And my view is, and this may seem a little bit iconoclastic, is that unions, police unions, are doing exactly what they were designed to do, which is to protect the interests of its membership. And they do so very well. My focus in the article and in general has been on the other side of that negotiation equation. I've had the privilege of being in collective bargaining negotiations with police unions, and they are very aggressive. But the reality is that most city councils ratify collective bargaining agreements put in front of them with very little question. And I think the public, the taxpayers, should be far more questioning about how their elected policymakers make decisions in terms of budgeting, in terms of settlements of liability, in terms of ratification of collective bargaining agreements, that those conversations should be happening in every community, which is, what do we want our police department to look like? Who do we want to have working as police officers? How do they deliver their service? Are there alternatives that we want other than a police response, and actually hold our elected officials accountable for that kind of decision making, because they are the ones, and it's in it firsthand, who approve lawsuits, design budgets and approve budgets and ratify contracts. And I think that's where some of the focus should really lie if we want to see the kind of improvements which folks are talking about here today.
Yes. I think we have a question over here.
Thank you all. So I have a question because there's a few threads of things that I wanted to, I heard throughout the panel that I wanted to kind of pull together. And some of that was, Michael, when you were talking about racial inequality and other social systems, it's thinking about, conversations about root causes. And Jesse, some of, what you were saying about how different cities are exploring, thinking about those things. And I think what I'm grappling with is, Michael, something you said at the end of your book, where you're talking about kind of what, like opportunities for elected officials to take action. And so I guess what I'm trying to understand is, if we know that policing as a representative of the state doesn't serve everyone, nor does it necessarily eliminate root causes of crime or violence. It makes me ask this question then, who is policing for? Where is policing necessary, meaning like spatially? But then also, how do you think about when is policing necessary situationally, and how elected officials can kind of take critical and important steps towards kind of clearly defining those things?
Those are three
That's
very
your
large.
next tweet, too.
Yeah,
right?
there you go.
That's-
Yeah, I'll do a thread on that one. Probably merits a couple. Those are a couple of really big questions. I think that to answer that question, the first step would be to recognize just how implicitly we assume that police are good options for so many things. You know, I've been to calls where a kid wasn't going to school and it was 3 units arrived. Why? Why are we here? You know, technically it was like a domestic violence call because 2 sisters got into a slap fight, but like, why are we here? I think that thinking more broadly about what are these things that we are sending officers to, and again, they're not even selecting into it, they are being called to be there, and which I think drives some resentment on the part of officers. Like, I'm going where you're calling me to be. I think that we can think more broadly about how often we think police are the right solution for things. You know, I think we've touched on guns a couple of times, and I do think that particularly in a place with more guns than people, approximately 15 million guns imported and produced every year, there will continue to be mass shootings, there will continue to be active shooters, and yeah, I would rather have agents of the state respond to that than, you know, people with a Glock 19 that they picked up the last weekend and have never trained on because we have permitless carry in more states now than ever before responding to that. So as far as thinking about polls, I don't think they should be going to the kid that doesn't want to go to school, and I do think that it probably should be the police over the average citizen responding to things like mass shootings. Obviously, most of what policing is somewhere in between those two things. And so I don't have a good answer as to specifically which are the ones that police should be going to. I can think of some clear ones where they should definitely be going, some clear ones where they should not be going. But I think even recognizing that is a good place to start. As far as the elected officials, you know, I'm on the Public Safety Commission in the city of Austin, so we don't have any teeth. We can't really do a whole lot besides ask questions and make recommendations. And this is not really part of the conversation, right? We are focused still on training, and I think that's important. Like, I'm in those conversations. We are not thinking really broadly about whether the police should be the de facto response for so many things. But I am hopeful that we will move in that direction and think about not just mental health as this like catch-all for alternative response, but just getting officers out of the business of taking cold burglary calls. And we actually already do that in some places. We just send like non-sworn people to take accident reports because it's a massive waste of time for sworn officers to be doing that. I think more of that is part of the direction that I would like to see that conversation move.
If I could,
No, go ahead. And I see 3 more hands in the audience, so quickly.
yeah, one thing I want to pick up with that too that can be challenging to think about in terms of what policing is for is just recognizing that one of the things it's often for is for maintaining the status quo, whatever that is. And one of the things that, you know, a number of the departments, you know, referring back to the national initiative we're talking about was using a historical understanding to kind of think about that. So I was thinking about work they were doing in Birmingham, and the chief there saying, like, I wear the uniform that Bull Connor wore, and we need to recognize that people wearing this uniform were going everywhere in this city and enforcing Jim Crow. And I think about like some of how Stockton in California was mining that history and saying, you know, this was the road that decades ago, it was like you didn't let Filipino people go like on this side of the road, and that is on the order side of law and order. Order gets defined in a lot of different ways politically by people, and like that is maybe in my mind like one of the toughest nuts to crack on policing. I mean, if the status quo is bad in a lot of ways, what law enforcement is doing is going to pick up that badness. I mean, there's a lot of systems that, you know, you could say by analogy are similar to that, but I do think that's one of the things that I really took out of the historical work that, you know, and the police departments were doing in that intervention is looking at that history, which often isn't that far back. You can see some of those things more clearly in a way that's hard to see what's going on right now in the same way.
Thank you. We have, here she comes.
Hi, everyone. I really appreciate this conversation and the sort of nuance of law enforcement or police officers being enforcers of laws that are often designed or maybe not intentionally or maybe some intentionally to perpetuate a systemic disparities and racism. To me, underpinning a lot of this, as I've observed work in community violence intervention and other alternative responses, is this fundamental question underpinning a lot of this discussion today, which is that law enforcement are often, responsible for responding to instances of witnessed or perceived violence. So I guess my question is does the witness of violence or the perception of violence necessitate more violence? And how, if we believe that fundamentally that could not be true, how do we explore testing that, right? How do we explore the opportunities to address violence without adding to it, without using any type of force at all? And is it too risky, perhaps, of a question to try to see if there are other ways other than adding to violence to remedy some of these situations? Because I think there is an assumption, both in law enforcement and in much of the people that are very strongly committed to the Second Amendment, that the risk of violence necessitates the ability to utilize violence yourself. So anyway, that might be really meta, but would love your thoughts.
Walter's leaning in, so he has
No,
something
I'm
to
just
say.
thinking, no, that's an intriguing question. And of course, I think that if we even look at the constitutional standard from Graham versus Connor, it does not require that the person upon whom force is being used by the police officer actually had engaged in violence. The officer just needs to have an objectively reasonable belief that a threat is imminent, right? So that does build in that presumption that violence could occur. As so much of this conversation today, it is simply, it's not easy. Using an example, again, of a family violence situation or a domestic violence situation, and an officer, responds to a call for service to an apartment of ongoing domestic violence, and it's a volatile situation, and one that, there's violence occurring. Should the officer not stop that? And that's kind of almost an easy one, yes. I think the challenge, though, is that I was listening to your question, I was thinking of some of those examples of the most controversial uses of force, is that violence was not occurring when that lethal force was used. Just those examples of those various black men who've been killed, very, very few were actually engaged in an act of violence. Walter Scott was simply just running away from a police officer when he was shot and killed and the taser was planted on him, right? So I think what I'm trying to grapple at is that necessity to separate out the types of conduct that we're talking about here. And by getting better at that, we try to bring down that discretionary use of force as close to zero as possible, as reasonable. The how we do that, yeah, I don't know.
There's a question over here. Thank you. And this, yeah. maybe we
Thank
get
you.
to more.
Thanks for today's conversation and really enjoyed the book. I think, Michael, this is mainly a question for you. So one thing I think might have missed today is sort of the reaction or perceptions from sworn law enforcement themselves. And I'm curious to know, how have sworn officers responded to either the book, to the danger imperative, to basically somebody who doesn't wear the badge saying, you are too worried, you're overly worried about safety. Just kind of interested to know your thoughts on that.
Thank you for that.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So for better and for worse, I've been talking about the danger imperative for about a decade now. So I've gotten to, hasn't happened as much as the book, at least in the current talks that I've been to, but I've given talks and I've had retired officers, former executives, former investigators, officers turned district attorneys, a bunch of folks in sort of the law enforcement adjacent space. The most critical of them do take a sort of very simplistic critique, which is, well, you've never been a cop, you can't possibly speak about this. Into that, generally, I would say, well, that puts us in a really unfortunate place for saying much about anything. Because if you have to do the thing to say something about it, then we're going to have all sorts of problems regulating, thinking about improving anything. And then I follow that up with, and I chose not to do a survey for a reason. I chose to get in the car for a reason. So they don't get to so simply wave away what I'm saying because I was never there. I was there. I was there for a long time, in 3 places. I talked to lots of officers. I've been in some of their homes. I've met some of their families. This is not a fly-by-night, couple of weekends in the car kind of thing. And so that doesn't convince those people anyways. But for I think other officers, they've said explicitly, like, if you hadn't been in a car, you'd have, like, I would not believe a word you said. So I think that's one. The next sort of middle ground critique is, sure, I can see how this could be bad, but this is necessary. And if we didn't do this, we would have more dead officers. And I think that that's an empirically defensible hypothesis. It is undoubtedly true, and I say as much in the book, there are cases where officers operating through the danger imperative have taken preemptive measures that have prevented violence from occurring or prevented their death, the death of another officer, or the death of an innocent person. That is undeniable. I think it's obvious on its face. How often that happens is unclear. I don't have any measure of that counterfactual, what would have happened if they hadn't done that. And it's frankly, it's so obvious that it's actually not part of what the book is about. I think what the book is trying to show is that if you justify it on those grounds, that it has some obvious benefit, you're missing all the downside. There are costs to this way of ensuring officer safety. There are costs that actively, negatively affect the well-being of the public, undermine police legitimacy, and as I talk about in chapter 4, ironically enough, actually make officers less safe. Not wearing your seatbelt for your safety makes no sense. Engaging in antagonistic, aggressive interactions in the name of command presence is actually a really good way to piss people off and escalate situations that then actually devolve into violence. Maybe not shootings, but it does turn into a shouting match. It does turn into going hands-on. It does turn into a tussle that maybe didn't need to happen. And then on the third side, the ones that are more, I think, they're more in line with the argument of the book, it's usually retired officers who I think have seen policing change. And so I don't have a great historical picture. It was 2014 to 18. But these officers have 30 years on. And they say, I don't know when it happened, but I saw this happening when I was in policing. And I'm glad that somebody has put a name to what I saw happening within the institution, something happening within my department that I tried to raise and nothing happened. I do think that I made it a point to write this book in such a way that even if you disagree with my conclusions and my analysis, you're going to be pretty hard-pressed to make a principled claim that what I'm saying is not real.
Okay, I think we have to end there. This has been such an incredible conversation, so much we can continue to talk about, and I hope we in fact do a little bit outside the room here. All of the speakers, Michael will be here to chat a little bit more, and you know where to find them, so please send them questions over email. I sort of have to do this. I don't have to do this, but I want to do it. He didn't tell me to, but this is the book. It exists. What we're talking about, it is, again, available for purchase outside the room here, and for folks who are joining us virtually, The Danger Imperative, Violence, Death, and the Soul of Policing. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. How long do we sit here?
Go.